Thanks everyone for tuning in. I don't even know how many people are listening to me right now. This is a very, very odd experience doing this remote. So please bear with me. As mentioned, my talk, the cool title I chose for it was Release Management, Chaos to Clockwork. And essentially today we're going to be talking, I want to give a disclaimer. What we're not going to be talking about is CI/CD, which is also very similar to some of the concepts we're going to be talking about, addressing those. But that is not what my talk is on. My talk is on the core components of building a good culture around release quality at your company. So that's things like documentation, what are the people doing that are running all of this, the pipelines, test pipelines you have set up, monitoring, RCA processes, stuff like that. So before I launch into anything, I want to just give a quick forward-looking statement. Base all of your purchasing decisions when it comes to Salesforce products based on what we have available, nothing else. So that's just now, and if you want to take a look deeper, the slides will be available. But now that I have the legal part out of the way, I can get into the good stuff. So as I mentioned, I live in San Francisco. I work at Salesforce. We're the one with the giant tower you see in the picture of the San Francisco skylines. I've been here for over 3 years now. I've held various different roles in release management. When I first came to Salesforce, my role was with the core Salesforce release management team. So that's the team that runs the entire release 3 times a year for Salesforce. If you're familiar with the product, you know we release kind of the same way the fashion industry releases because we think that much of ourselves. So I was on the team of about 12 people who ran those worldwide releases to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, just ridiculous numbers impacting all sorts of Salesforce users across the world. So that team was a very well-oiled machine when it came to release management. They had been doing what they had been doing for over 10 years when I had joined. So I was able to learn a lot of things from that team, like how do you lead change? How do you manage complex scenarios? How do you manage scary, like when it hits the fan, you know? How do you lead that forward, kind of cat herd a bunch of panicked engineers towards getting a fix out and managing customer expectations? And at the end of the day, that on that team, I think the key thing I took away is always acting as the voice of the customer. So sometimes when you're in a room and you're trying to decide how to release something, what to release, if you're going to fix forward, roll back, people are thinking what's the easiest thing to do for us, and the release manager will be the one speaking up, but what is the best choice for the customer? So that's a little bit about the first team I was on at Salesforce. And after doing that for a while, I got recruited by a newer product within Salesforce that was running away from our core infrastructure on AWS. It was called Einstein Platform. Einstein Platform is our AI product. It offers cool things like prediction builder, case class. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm not trying to sell you on anything right now. But all you need to know is a new product, kind of a startup-y environment within the company that was away from all the normal company processes. And I was brought on board there as a release manager. They needed someone to set up their release process. And since I had experience at Core, they thought I'd be a good person to do that. So I did that for a hot second. And then after a while, I now manage the team of quality engineers. So we have a couple of people doing like setting up functional testing, making sure that the product we're pushing out is of high quality and kind of holding all of our development teams to that standard. So I love my company. I love what I do. I've learned a lot and I'm still learning. But what I want to give you out of this presentation is if you're someone who's trying to figure out how to better release quality code, if it's just like things aren't working, if releases are a headache for your team, for your org, for your product, I'm hoping to give you a framework to start to think about improving that. So let's talk about getting into the weeds. I mentioned a little bit. I was sorry, my cat's tail is in the frame. This is how I felt when I joined my latest org. I was kind of like very scared. I came in like with a big swagger in my stuff. I was like, oh, I work at core Salesforce. I can set up your release process. But the reality of it was there's no like starting blocks even to like the way releases were being run at the product where I'm at now when I joined way back was that it was kind of like very ad hoc, very chaotic. People didn't really know what was going on. I remember specifically my first like, oh crap moment where I like this job is going to be way harder than I thought it was going to be was when I sat down to run my first like release window meeting where we at the time when I joined, we were like kind of releasing everyone in one window to minimize impact to customers. And when I sat down in that release room, ready to run a release like I normally did, I was like, I looked at the first service up for release and I was like, okay, you ready? Let's go ahead and release. And there was like kind of a weird silence when I said that, because I'm like, okay, this is weird. I checked, we have the SR on call, we have the developer on call, why can't we release? And then the development team is like, I don't know how to release. And at that point, I realized that the entire past few months of this product releasing, like they've kind of been figuring out how to deploy to prod as they were deploying to prod. But I do want a disclaimer. At the time, we were not GA. We didn't have paying customers. We didn't have any customers, so it was fine. We were still figuring things out. That's why I was there. But yeah, so it was very messy. Nothing was really in place. And I want to talk about the main components of how did you get things in place in this really messy scenario. So I think like most things, quality releases are built up from a combination of people, process, and culture. And like you'll see this at any time someone's like, oh, here's a big initiative you should work on. You got to concentrate on the people, the process, and the culture. So the bulk of this presentation is going to be on the process, but I also want to give a quick note based on my experience about the people and the culture. So let's get into the people first. This is where we actually start talking about what I've been going on about for the past few minutes. The people that make up a good kind of release management team when you're game day deploying, you should have on the call. One is the release manager. And so I have an asterisk here because if you're at a smaller company, if you don't quite have the funds to just hire someone to fix this process for you full time, you can make do by doing some sort of rotation between development teams within your SRE team, something like that. The release engineer should be the person who is kind of the pro at deploying stuff into. It could also be the build and deploy engineer. I'm sure everyone has a different word for them. But essentially they're the ones that know how things get deployed to prod. And if there's an issue and it has to do with that part of the process, they can help debug that. Site reliability engineer. I think there's more than enough talks and content on the internet about what this role is and what makes a good one. So I'm not going to go deep into that, but the SRE should be the one who's kind of like the prod whisperer is the way I like to describe it. And then finally, you should have someone online. And again, this is all not CI/CD if you're trying to get towards CI/CD, which I'll cover in a later slide. This is kind of the ad hoc war team you should have on the call. Yeah, so the development team member should be able to make if you need to roll back, you ask the development team, what kind of changes is this? Is this something we can roll back? Do we have to fix forward? What's the nature of the issue? They can validate the change going out, all of that good stuff. No, so that's the team you should be working with when you're releasing something. Quick note on the release management role. So I mentioned it could be a rotational situation, but if you are fortunate enough to have the resources to hire someone to do this full time, the kind of skills you should look for in that person, I've seen generally people who are more extroverted are better at this, but I've also seen some really great introverts master this role. So beyond that, just the key skill beyond everything else is they need to be comfortable speaking up. They need to be comfortable speaking up against the grain. Even if everyone just like wants to go home, they need to be the one saying the painful thing. Like, you guys, this part of the release went wrong. We got to address it. We're going to have to be online for like another 4 or 5 hours. So that's a skill. I think it can be coached into people because I've seen it get coached into people. A couple books I would recommend, even if you're trying to build out that skill in yourself. One is Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And then another one that's just great for building up culture is The Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey. So I mentioned culture, and that book I just mentioned, The Speed of Trust. You need to build a culture of trust. And I don't just mean trust in between the engineers in your company. I also mean trust between the company and the customer. So this is where the release manager comes into play, acting as the voice of the customer. Sometimes I think developers, depending on the size of the company and your existing culture, sometimes can get divorced from the customer experience. So they're trying to move quick, break things, and depending on your company, the nature of your business, that's not always the right model, right? For companies with non-paying customers, maybe that works. Maybe for a social media app or something, it's okay to occasionally push out bugs as you're testing new things. But if you're working for, I don't know, a large CRM company whose customers are like major banks, sometimes really important institutions, and sometimes like you've got hospitals, call centers for emergencies, depending on your product. You can't really, you got to adjust your risk margin. And so you need a culture, again, where everyone in the company understands the product, the customer, and is making the right decisions, even if it's uncomfortable at the end of the day. I'm going through the process in a second, the different components of this, but I think the key takeaway with culture is that it doesn't happen overnight. It needs to be a consistent effort over time. I usually find about 2 months is when things start to be sticking, like people start expecting things instead of you telling them this is the new process. And what I mean by this is like RCAs, so root cause analysis, doing a root cause analysis whenever you have a major issue, setting the culture, the expectation, like, yes, this is something we do. It's not something we do sometimes, it's something we do all the time, and you will be held accountable for filling it out. Even try and spin it as it's something fun to do. I mean, honestly, I enjoy them. So making sure that the culture is something that's going to let all of these processes you put in place to build up a good release culture to stick. So next, let's go into the process. These are going to be the technical requirements of a good release process. And since I've thought about this a lot, I've broke it down into 4 main components. So there's documentation, there's the pipelines of getting things out, there's repository management, and there's monitoring. And within all of these categories, there's some specific action items to take to make sure you're doing. But these were kind of the repeat patterns I've seen in all the new products I've set up release management for, and going really from nothing to a full-fledged mature release process with my latest organization, my latest product. So I'm sure there's other approaches to this, but I found this was really helpful to think about it on my end. And this is kind of how I format it when I'm approaching improving release processes on any new product I'm consulting for. So let's start with documentation. I think this is obvious. You're like, yeah, Katherine, of course you should have documentation. But I think it needs to be repeated just because I've gone to so many people talking to them about their release process, and they're like, yeah, we have documentation. But when you really like drill down into the meat of it, it's not full. It's not 100%. And I really like a coworker of mine once said that the death of a product comes from information black holes. So if you let that sink in a bit and think about what it means, it's essentially without proper documentation, it becomes impossible to reason about what the software you're building actually does. And this is just going to get worse as there's more people coming in, more people leaving to do other things. So you really need to have that good documentation muscle. Yeah. So like the main things to think about here when you're like, how do I improve my documentation? If you're in a microservice architecture, making sure that every service has an entry in your service Rolodex. Your next question might be, what is a service Rolodex? And I don't care. It should be a list of the services you have, some more information about that service, where the repo is, just who owns it, stuff like that. You can use, I think PagerDuty has a really cool feature within their product to allow you to do this. So just making sure every service has that fully filled out. You have a template for what information you need included. Or if you don't want to do that and set up PagerDuty or do that over an extended period of time, honestly, a spreadsheet will be more than enough as long as you have like a quarterly reminder for all of the product owners to check in and update it. So start small if you don't want to do like this grand, complex feature in another product. Service overview is really important. As your product grows, it's going to get more complex. So what a service overview should do is like, if someone new is joining the team working on that specific service, that specific component of the product, what are the things they need to know? What are some issues around deployment they need to be wary of? How does it work? What are dependent services that could potentially calls out to could break it, stuff like that. And then finally, definition of done. And I know this is either you work in an agile environment I don't even need to say the next thing I'm going to say, or you don't and you're like, what's definition of done? So I'm going to, just in case there's any of the second people on the call, go into that a bit. It should have a list of what are the checks before you can mark an action item closed, before a feature can be closed or a bug can be closed. And I highly suggest you spend like a couple hours speeding out what definition of done will look like for your entire organization, and holding people accountable to that. All right, so that was on documentation. Next, we're going to talk about the test and deploy pipeline. So you have from documentation, you know what you're working on. Now the next step is testing and shipping. And so what does this look like? For the test pipeline, you should have necessary tests documented and in place for kind of each stage in the path to production. And I know everyone has a different approach to setting up test environments. There's like devs, staging, there's some people have pre-prod, you have like a performance environment. So instead of going into a complex like diagram of when should you test in what environment, I found it helpful to just have a high level value set of when to test, where to test. So this is kind of the test, the list of when to test that I use. And so that's upon, again, tests are documented in place and automatically run upon every new check-in for new code going to any environment, before any release to a shared environment, certainly before any release to production. And then notice the one word different in this last item, after any release to production. And like most of this presentation, I feel like you're probably going to be like, okay, some of this stuff is common sense, but I do want to call out that I will see situations where people aren't running like smoke tests or like simple end-to-end tests after they release to production. They'll do it just before, and sometimes there's simple issues that these automatic tests can catch. And as we're talking about testing, I want to add a reminder to always always add regression tests upon the closure of any major customer impacting bugs. And the reason I have this here is because for users, regressions are especially hairy issues because people are generally understanding of, oh, a new feature, okay, it's buggy, we're still beginning to use it, that's fine. But in my experience, customers get really frustrated when an existing thing that was working before broke and then fixed, and they're continuing to use that thing to rely on getting their job done. When that suddenly breaks again, that it's a whole different set of emotions than a new feature that breaks. So always add regression tests when you have major customer impacting issues. You'll thank me later, I promise. And I'm not going into what kinds of tests should be here because that's not what this talk is about, but I'll mention there's a good article. Just Google the testing pyramid and you'll get an idea of what that is. You should have the basic suite. You should have some unit. You should have a bunch of unit tests. You should have some UI tests. I already mentioned regression tests. You should have functional tests. Upgrade tests are useful to have. So if you have a complex upgrade process for your product, does everything work the same before? Does it work the same the after? And does it work the same as you're upgrading? And then also performance tests, of course, and then finally smoke and sanity tests. Sometimes they're called heartbeat tests. I've been working in quality a bit now, and I've noticed that everyone refers to different kinds of tests differently. But essentially what I'm trying to get to with that last thing is after you deploy to prod, just kind of doing some basic functions on your product, making sure everything's still green and working. And then, so we have everything tested, and let's talk about the deploy pipeline. So teams should be able to run and understand their own deployments. And in my experience, in my current product I'm working on, it's something that we have the luxury of doing. I'm sure it's not the same everywhere, but it's really useful for teams to run and understand their own deployments because it adds an extra component of engineering knowledge. They'll know in advance if we change this part of how our service works, is it gonna break if we roll back that change? What are other services we have to be wary of when we're deploying this new change? So being familiar with the deployment process, how that changes, how their service is accessed by other service during the process, and what happens after, what our options are after if we do fall into a kind of game day situation where something breaks. No service interruption. Again, another obvious thing that I'm calling out here, especially if you're in that newer product group and you have the luxury of building this in to start with, it's a lot more difficult and a headache to do later. So making sure that when a microservice on your platform deploys, that there's no service interruption as that happens. There's a million ways you can do this. I'm not going to go into it. My key takeaway I'm trying to give you here is make sure that that from day one, you're not having an expectation of downtime when you deploy. And I'll give, honestly, Salesforce up until recently was a good example of this. When we had major releases, there is an expected downtime for customers. That's why you get the little alert on your screen when there's a release coming up. And that just it's something that if you're building a new product now, you have the luxury to get around. You can not, it will not be a very expensive dollar project for you to fix that down the line if you start now. Anyway, the ability to roll back, make sure that your services can roll back. I know sometimes it's just hard to have a change that's always able to be rolled back. Maybe it changes the way data is stored, and if you roll back, that's technically data loss. And I'm sure there's a way to get around that if you build a really complex set of flags of how to use things when. If you want to do that, I suggest having like some sort of rollback testing running in a pre-prod environment, if that's something you want to test for. But it is good to have a base, what's the word I'm looking for? Reliance on the fact that, okay, I'm in this room, we're releasing a new feature. I want to know that I can rely on any service being able to roll back if that service starts to get buggy. And if you're not able to roll back, the development team of that service should be calling it out during the release meeting, during the release process. You should say, like, this isn't something we can roll back. So don't try and roll it back if things go wrong, because other things will break. Yeah, so build and test failures should not just be tracked by humans. You should have a ticketing system. You should hold yourself to that ticketing system. And when you have a build or test failure come up at any point in any environment, it should automatically create a ticket for that. Otherwise, you get in the situations where build's broken for a couple hours, everyone's upset, no one gets any work done. And then you'll have sometimes minor bugs propagate through towards production, and you really want to be tracking that. You also want to track trends. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? So yeah, this is, again, obvious things, but this is a list of items that you should double down on if you want the quality of your releases to get better. Finally, I have a measly one line in this entire presentation on CI/CD. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. The main reason is, again, there's a million presentations you can watch on how do I set up a continuous integrated continual deployment pipeline. If you don't know what that is, it's a way, essentially think I check in as a developer, I check in this piece of code. I don't have to worry about the process about it getting to prod. If it gets to prod, great. If it doesn't, I know it'll come back to me. I'll get an alert and I'll go in and fix things. But when it comes back to me, essentially, I know that it's taken out of every environment it could have caused harm in. That should be the end goal, and you should have a plan to get there. But in the interim, you're going to have to really double down on all of these things I'm talking about today. Yeah, so I think that's it on deploy pipeline. We talked about testing, deploy pipeline. We talked about documentation. So we're about the point in the presentation. We've got about half of it left for those of you who are getting antsy. And the last two things are repository management and monitoring. So I'm going to talk about repository management as one of these four components, because I think that it can be a major headache. It can be a major time and productivity sink for all of your engineers. And this is also one of those things that can get hairy as you grow, as you scale. If you're kind of letting everyone do their own thing, every microservice creates their own repository, takes their own approach to that repository, setting it up, like permissions, structure, README. It's when you're gonna be like, okay, this is fine when we have 3 services, but what happens when you have like 15 or 30? It's gonna be a nightmare. And there's a bunch of stuff like versioning. I'll get to it in the next slide. But what I want you to take away from here is that for your engineers to do what they're doing, they're doing best, what they're hired to do, what they love to do, you should make the process of doing that super easy for them. So when it comes to repository management, the way I suggest doing that is first start off with your service versioning. And again, this is one of the things where you have 3 services, maybe it's less of an issue, but when you have 30, you're going to wish, oh yeah, I should have used the same versioning system across all of my services. Well, a highly recommended one is semantic versioning. So that's taking kind of you have a release, for example, 1.4.10. And the first number is like major changes, entire like new feature sets. The middle number is like more patchy, smaller changes. And then that final number is like little tiny tweaks. I'm also a fan of just year, month versioning, and then the last part of it is the build number. So like 2020.0 maybe you're on the 17th build of that. I personally like the latter because you can clearly look at the version and see when the last time the service released was. It gives you a really good idea of like how fresh is this release, stuff like that. Peer review should be required on all PRs. And again, start with this early, not later. This is actually, a lot of this is just basic auditing requirements if you want to get your first level certification in like SOC or HIPAA. And then if needed, changes to production should be auto integrated downstream. And it's, so I talked about like branching and release process should follow a best practice. And there's all sorts of things. There's chunk-based development, there's Git flow. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I promise you can Google it and know within 5 minutes. But some of these handle situations where you're using a different branch to deploy to prod than the one you're developing in. Some of them can handle that better than others. If you're using something like Git flow, where you have separate branches for each environment, the reason why I have this call out here is if you have an emergency release to prod and you develop off the prod branch and then deploy that to prod, you're going to want to take that change that you put into the prod branch and make sure it was put into all of the other branches. And you need to have automation to do that. You cannot rely on engineers remembering to do that. I've been doing this for several years. I've seen it not work. You can't really rely on humans. We're very, very confused a lot of the time and easy to trick, even accidentally. So make sure that there's automation in process to make sure any changes are always auto integrated to downstream branches. And then finally, change should be tracked. This, again, I've talked about auditing requirements. This is going to be an auditing requirement for you if you don't already have it in place. But things that are going out, you should know what changes are in your release. If you're doing like release notes, that's great, but you should know specifically what the bug numbers are of stuff going out in this release. And this is important, especially when it comes to like random issues that come up and you're like, where do I even start debugging this? If you have tracked change that you can tie to a release, to a deployment, it's going to make it a lot easier to like narrow the scope of potential starting spots of the issue. You know, okay, these few changes went in. Let's start with these teams. Yeah. So that, I think I've tired out